So I recently had a discussion with Eric Hernandez just the other day, and I would like to do a little discussion review. But before I do, I want to just say, thank you, Eric, for the opportunity to talk with you. It was really fun. I think you're a great guy, and just because we disagree doesn't mean I hate you. And I'm certainly not like some of the people that you've talked to in the past. But that being said, your picture on your website is kind of weird, but it's. I'm sorry, that was just fun. Okay, so what we're going to be doing is a discussion review of the opening statements, and then at some point I might go through more of the discussion at some point and get into some of the meat and what I could have done better and argued better. But what I want to do now is kind of just look at what we discussed in the opening statements and where I think I should have addressed things a little further, but it's kind of comes down to me being a little bit unfamiliar with some of the specific arguments that he brought up. Now, I am familiar with some of them. They weren't cited super clearly, and I don't think that's Eric's fault. He was, tired in the morning. I wasn't feeling too good myself, so we were both a little bit off, I think. And Eric didn't really have a lot of time to prepare, and it wasn't a formal debate anyway, so I'm not beating him up about that. But I've had time now to go look at premises and conclusions and responses and kind of dig through this a little bit deeper. And I wanted to address a little bit of this. So first of all, Eric cites the argument of the argument from reason, which is the evolutionary argument against naturalism. Now, it's a philosophical. I have a trouble with that word. I had trouble with it when we were doing the discussion too. It's a philosophical argument asserting a problem with believing both evolution and philosophical naturalism at the same time. So let's roll the clip.
Suppose there is a car coming towards me. I form the belief that there's a car coming towards me, and if I don't move out of the way, it's going to kill me. So based on that belief, I jump out of the way and I survive. Now, given natural selection, if our beliefs are going to be passed on, or our brain states are going to be passed on, and if our beliefs are what cause our actions, then the point of natural selection is going to be aimed at passing on behaviors and selecting for behaviors that grant survival value, not necessarily truth value. Take the same illustration and suppose, again, a car's coming towards me, but I form the belief there's a car coming towards me. I also have the belief that I am Superman, and if it hits me, it's not going to kill me. However, I want to preserve my identity as Clark Kent, and I don't want people to know I'm Superman. So I jump out of the way of the car, and so that way people think I'm still human and I'm not Superman. And the point is, although that belief was false, it still granted survival value. And the only thing natural selection is concerned about, and I'm personifying here, is that our beliefs form and give us behaviors that are adapted for survival and not necessarily truth.
Okay, so first of all, to me, this is an irrelevant argument because I'm not a philosophical naturalist. Why do I have trouble with that word? I am not a philosophical naturalist. There we go. Philosophical naturalism is the assertion that only the natural world exists. I am a methodological naturalist, which means I operate under the lack of evidence for anything other than the natural world, and we can only address that which occurs in the natural world. But let's try to dig into this a little bit anyway. So, Eric, keep going.
In other words, if there is no God and your brain was not designed with cognitive faculties as a mechanism designed to obtain truth, it really doesn't matter whether or not your beliefs are true. The only thing that matters is that your beliefs give us adaptive survival.
So what Eric is basically saying here, if I understand correctly, is that from natural selection, what our beliefs are only adaptations meant to help us continue the species and to survive. And it has nothing to do with truth necessarily. To an extent, I actually would agree with this. There is, for example, this idea of type 1 and type 2 errors. And a type 1 error is like, for example, seeing a predator in a bush that isn't there, but you run away anyway and you survive. But this is a false positive. A type 2 error is when you don't run away from the predator and you get eaten by the predator in the bush. Essentially, Eric is citing the type 1 error, saying that this demonstrates that there is not necessarily truth that our beliefs are leading to. And essentially, the argument can be boiled down to the fact that we have evolved to have beliefs, but that does not guarantee that our beliefs are based in any truth. I agree with this, and I do not see it as a very compelling argument because it doesn't mean we can't get closer to truth or close to truth. In the case of the type 1 error, while it may be true that I ran away from a non-existent predator, it doesn't make it any less true that the reason I would do this is because I believe that I could possibly be in danger, and it benefits my survival to run away from the rustling bush at any time that I experience this phenomenon, because historically that's what would happen. So this argument does not, however, in any way demonstrate that the reliability of our cognitive faculties are unreliable. And so what's the solution to this anyway? God? God exists, and this solves the problem of unreliable cognitive faculties? But how? How does the God solve this problem? It seems to me that a God, it must be a God of the gaps. That's kind of what I'm getting at it is, that we must posit a God to make our own cognitive faculties reliable. And while it is true that our cognitive faculties can be unreliable, it does not follow that we cannot assess reality in some other way to determine what is most likely the case. And Eric gave this example.
Excuse me. You wake up and you see that you look at the microwave and you see that the microwave says 12 o'clock. Then you also feel that it's very hot in the room. There's actually water under the fridge. You notice actually that the microwave is blinking 12 o'clock. Now, from this, you form the belief that the power went out. And while the microwave may say 12 o'clock, you actually don't know whether or not it's 12 o'clock. In other words, even though you form the belief it's 12 o'clock by looking at the microwave, also know that your belief that it is 12 o'clock is based on the reading of the microwave, which, given that the power went out, it now poses an undercutting defeater for rationally holding to the belief it is 12 o'clock, given that the microwave, which is based on the power went out. So you now have a reason to not believe or distrust the belief that it is 12 o'clock.
So in the example of the clock, is there another way to determine what time it is besides looking at those clocks that Eric mentioned? Well, if you use an analog clock that isn't dependent on the power grid, perhaps, or you can walk outside and see if the sun is out, and if it is, then clearly it wouldn't be 12 a.m. In the case of this type 1 error, I can find other ways to interact with the bush safely to investigate whether there was in fact anything in the bush to be worried about in the first place. Perhaps by constructing a stick that I can use to poke the bush from a distance, or wait and watch to see if something comes out of the bush at all. The argument is essentially limiting us only to the survival mechanism, and it doesn't take into account any pragmatic views and our ability to investigate further. In fact, yes, if my clocks are all powered down at the same time, I wouldn't know on that basis what time it actually is. But why do we assume there's only one way to assess what time it is? And why is it that we can't investigate further later on? We are not stuck in just the here and now in this very moment to have to make instantaneous decisions on everything we experience. Now, sometimes that is the case, like Eric gave the example of the bus. But that's not always the case. In fact, it's very rarely the case. And the argument ignores our ability to use other information that we could or would have access to determine, to the extent that we can, the truth value of a proposition. And what's particularly interesting is that he calls this an undercutting defeater for any belief, including the belief that there is no God. But what about the belief that there is a God? Wouldn't that fall under the umbrella of any belief? But that means that there's an undercutting defeater for the belief that there is a God. And he's asserting that the God resolves this issue and is the only way to resolve the problem, but never explain how the God does this and what the God is doing to resolve it. And when saying that there's an undercutting defeater for any belief, excluding the belief in God purely by assertion, it makes the argument guilty of special pleading and begging the question. I may expand on this argument a little bit further with Eric, and maybe he can respond to this at some point, but I'd like to move on to his next argument.
Nevertheless, you would still need something like libertarian free will. Why is that? Because you'd have to be able to rationally be free to examine the evidence and not be causally determined to believe the things that you do.
So now it seems that he's tacking on to the previous argument, to which I contend there's a logical fallacy of special pleading and begging the question. But let's disregard that for a moment and address this. So specifically, Eric says that you need to be free, you need to have free will, so that you can be free to examine the evidence and not be determined to believe what you do. But what if I don't have free will? Does that mean I still can't examine evidence? What if I'm determined to examine evidence? To me, this is a non sequitur, and I don't see how it demonstrates free will is necessary to be able to examine evidence. The mere fact that I might be pre-programmed to examine only X doesn't mean that I'm not also pre-programmed to examine x plus y or x plus y plus z. This simply does not follow and does not demonstrate that I cannot rationally form beliefs about the world around me. Let me break this down a little bit more. So first of all, I don't think we can get to truth in any absolute sense. And by truth, I mean that, we couldn't determine absolutely the nature of the ultimate reality outside of our own heads. I am a pragmatist, and I think that we can probably only assess the world around us through empirical evidence that we experience through our senses. But I don't think we can necessarily determine any sort of truth or absolutely confirm any belief. And Eric seemed to agree with this to an extent too. But I do not think that this is a defeater to rationality, because rationality doesn't require us to get to truth. And when I tend to use the word true, I mean true to the extent that our cognitive faculties allow. It is true to the extent that my senses allow that I am speaking into a microphone right now. It is true to the extent that my senses allow that the world is an oblate spheroid. I am forced by practical necessity and pragmatism to interact with the world that I interact with. So when Eric uses the term knowledge and defines it as justified true belief, I agree with that definition largely, but I think he is, not on purpose, mind you, strawmanning how I would define what a true belief is in order to make that assertion. And then he goes on to the law of causal closure. Let's take a look.
Given your neurons firing was a physical event, the question would still arise, and what caused that neuron fire to fire? Well, causal closure, it must be a prior physical event. At this point is where the physicalist would have a problem, because now you have basically two options, which will not lead to any type of return free will. You could first say, well, another neuron fired in order to fire the first neuron, and that's what caused my hand to move and so forth. Then that only pushes back the goalpost, and the problem still arises. And eventually you'll get into an infinite regress in which the will never move to move the staff to move the rock.
So it should be clarified. I'm a bit of a student of calculus. So I went all the way up to calculus 3 in college, and I'm, taking physics and all this stuff. I'm not an expert by any means, but I've taught it and I've studied it. So I want to clarify that infinite regresses are not demonstrably real in reality. They are mathematical, theoretical constructs. This is something I have a discussion with theists all the time about. As far as I can tell, any real infinity is simply an abstraction, and it's not something in actuality. I often like to use Zeno's paradox as a demonstration for this. One of them that I often cite is, for instance, I shoot an arrow at a target, and the distance between me and the target can be divided in half infinitely, meaning that the arrow could never really get to the target because it would have to cross half the distance to the target forever in order to get there. So you have an infinite regression of divisions to the target, but this is just a mathematical abstraction and doesn't apply to reality. And we know this because I can shoot an arrow at a target and hit the target. Well, I probably can't, but other people who are good at archery probably could. So clearly the infinity is an abstract model and not a model in reality. It is, in calculus, we refer to these as limits. So we have the as we approach infinity kind of thing. It does not necessarily follow that if we can posit an infinite regress of causes, that this would prevent me from moving the rock with the pen in Eric's example. That is simply a mathematical, theoretical idea that he's proposing, and it doesn't follow in reality. He's confusing the abstract with the actual, which means he's confusing the map for the place. This is another logical fallacy. But let's agree hypothetically that the infinite regress is real. I can't get to now because there's an infinite regress of causality. Well, what was Eric's solution to this? Once again, you need God to do it. But again, how does the God solve this problem? In what way does God act as a closure to the causal chain of events? How can you possibly demonstrate that? This is an argument from personal incredulity as I see it. That is, I can think of no solution to the problem of an infinite regression unless there is a God, so therefore a God exists. That just doesn't follow, and it's never explained how the God solves the causal regression problem. It's simply asserted as a stopgap. So I really want to thank you all for watching this. I may continue this breakdown in a part 2 discussion, or of the discussion in part 2, though I think most of it speaks for itself, and it may be better for me to get an outsider's perspective on the discussion to figure out where I went right, where I went wrong, and what I can do better next time to clarify my points. Thank you so much for watching, and don't forget to check out Eric's channel down in the description below, and appreciate you all watching, and I'll see you next time. Bye-bye.